It started with a sound. A faint creak, like the groan of a floorboard under someone's weight, echoing through the darkened hallway. At first I thought it was just the house settling, it was old after all. But then it happened again, louder this time and closer. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the house was holding its breath. I told myself to calm down, that it was nothing. But deep down I knew better. This house had never felt like home. From the moment we moved in, something about it had been off. My parents had brushed off my unease. "It's just an old house," my dad had said, patting my shoulder. "Old houses make noises." And my mom, ever the optimist, had added, "Once we get settled you'll see, it's perfect. Look at all this space." But space wasn't the problem. It was the way the shadows seemed to linger too long, or how the air in certain rooms felt heavy, like it was pressing against my chest. Even the light seemed different here, dimmer somehow, even when the sun was shining. That night, as I sat frozen in bed, staring at the open door of my room, I realized something else. I wasn't imagining it. The house wasn't just old. It was alive. Watching. Waiting. I didn't know it then, but that sound in the hallway was only the beginning. The next morning I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. After all, I was new to the house and maybe my imagination had gotten the best of me. But as I stepped into the hallway, the uneasy feeling returned, creeping up my spine like cold fingers. The hallway was quiet now, bathed in the weak morning light filtering through the dusty windows. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. My eyes landed on the far end of the hall, where the door to the attic loomed, slightly ajar. "Why's the attic open?" I muttered to myself, though the words offered little comfort. At breakfast I decided to ask my parents. "Did one of you go into the attic last night?" My dad glanced up from his coffee, his expression confused. "The attic? No, why?" "It was open this morning," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I heard something last night, footsteps." My mom laughed lightly, though there was a nervous edge to it. "It's probably just the wind. You know how drafty this place is." "Drafty?" That was a stretch. The air in the house felt too still, like it was holding its breath. But I didn't press further. They wouldn't believe me anyway. Later that day, while unpacking boxes in my room, I noticed something strange. The closet door, which I had firmly shut earlier, was now slightly open. My stomach twisted as I approached it, every instinct screaming for me to leave it alone. But I couldn't ignore it. Inside everything seemed normal, just clothes and boxes. But as I turned to walk away, I noticed something scrawled faintly on the inside of the door, hidden beneath peeling paint. "Don't trust the walls." When we moved into the house, it was supposed to be a fresh start. My parents had been so excited, talking endlessly about how much better things would be now. Dad had landed a new job in the city, and Mom was thrilled at the idea of renovating an authentic Victorian home. I wanted to be excited too, but from the moment I saw the house, something felt wrong. It wasn't just the way it looked, though the chipped paint, overgrown yard, and sagging roof didn't help. It was the way it felt, like stepping into a space that didn't want us there. I couldn't explain it, but the air seemed heavier, thicker, as if the house itself was alive and watching. I was 16, old enough to know my parents wouldn't take my unease seriously. They were too caught up in their plans to notice the way the shadows moved when no one was looking, or how the floors creaked even when no one was walking on them. So I kept my feelings to myself, hoping the strange sensations would pass once we'd settled in. But they didn't. If anything, they got worse. The attic door opening on its own was just the beginning. Little things started happening, things I couldn't explain. Objects would disappear and reappear in places I hadn't left them. Lights flickered, even though my dad insisted the wiring was fine. And then there were the sounds, soft, almost imperceptible, like whispers just out of earshot. My parents brushed it all off, of course. "It's an old house," my dad would say. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But I knew better. Something wasn't right, and the scrawled message inside the closet door, "Don't trust the walls," felt like a warning I couldn't ignore. The message inside the closet door haunted me. "Don't trust the walls." Who had written it and why? I thought about telling my parents, but I could already imagine their response. My mom brushing it off as an old prank, my dad sighing and telling me to stop making things up. So I stayed quiet and decided to figure it out on my own. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the house settled around me. Every creak, every groan of the wooden beams felt amplified, each one setting my nerves on edge. I clutched the blanket tightly, willing myself to sleep, but the unease was too strong. Around midnight I heard it again, the sound that had woken me the night before. A faint creak followed by another, this time closer. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The hallway was dark, the faint glow of the moon barely filtering through the curtains. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling again, but something about it felt deliberate. Summoning my courage, I got out of bed and crept toward the door. The hallway stretched out before me, empty and silent. I glanced toward the attic door at the far end, half expecting it to be open again, but it was closed. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered, like I wasn't alone. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The word seemed to vanish into the stillness, swallowed by the thick air. For a moment, there was nothing, and I started to convince myself it was my imagination. But then, just as I turned to go back to bed, I heard it, 3 soft knocks coming from inside the wall. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The knocks came again, louder this time and closer to where I was standing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it an animal? The plumbing? Or something else? Backing away slowly, I returned to my room and shut the door, pressing my back against it as my heart hammered in my chest. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. The next morning I made a decision. If the walls were hiding something, I was going to find out what it was. The next morning I grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver from the garage, determined to figure out what was going on behind the walls. My parents were busy unpacking downstairs, too distracted to notice as I carefully unscrewed the vent cover in the hallway. The opening was small but just wide enough for me to peek inside. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the narrow space between the walls. At first all I saw was dust and cobwebs, but as I looked closer I noticed something strange: scratch marks on the wooden beams. They were faint but deliberate, as though someone had been clawing at the walls from the inside. My stomach churned. What could have caused that? I aimed the flashlight deeper, and that's when I saw it. A piece of folded paper wedged between the beams. My hands trembled as I reached inside, the paper crinkling under my fingers. Pulling it out, I carefully unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note. "If you're reading this, it's already too late. Don't let them know you've seen this." The message was short, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. Who had written it? And what did they mean by them? I stared at the note, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. Before I could process what I'd found, I heard a voice behind me. "What are you doing?" I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight, and turned to see my mom standing at the end of the hallway. Her arms were crossed, her expression a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "Nothing," I said quickly, tucking the note into my pocket. "I thought I heard something in the vent. Maybe an animal." Her frown deepened. "You shouldn't mess with things like that," she said. "It's an old house. The less we disturb it, the better." Her choice of words sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Just that old houses have a way of holding on to things. Memories, stories. Sometimes it's better to leave them alone." Her tone was casual, but her words lingered long after she walked away. Did she know more than she was letting on? And if so, why wasn't she telling me? My mom's words left me uneasy. Old houses have a way of holding on to things. Did she mean it literally, or was she hinting at something she didn't want to say outright? Either way, I couldn't let it go. That note hidden in the wall felt like a warning, one I couldn't ignore. Later that afternoon, while my parents were out running errands, I decided to check the attic. If the walls were hiding secrets, maybe the attic held more clues. Armed with my flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I climbed the narrow staircase and pushed open the creaky attic door. The air inside was stale and heavy, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the wooden beams. Dust motes danced in the weak light streaming through a small, cracked window. The space was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs, just as I'd expected. But something about it felt like the silence was too complete, as if the attic itself were holding its breath. I scanned the room with my flashlight, my eyes landing on a trunk in the far corner. It was large and weathered, its leather straps cracked with age. I approached it cautiously, every creak of the floorboards beneath me making my heart race. The trunk's lock was rusted and loose, and it broke apart easily when I twisted it. Lifting the lid, I found a collection of items that seemed innocent at first. Old clothes, books, and photographs. But as I dug deeper, my unease grew. Tucked beneath the layers of fabric was a small black notebook. The cover was plain, but the pages inside were anything but. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, as though written in a hurry. Each page detailed strange occurrences in the house. Objects moving on their own, whispers in the night, shadows that didn't belong. One entry caught my attention immediately. They're watching. Always watching. The walls aren't just walls. They hold more than this house should. If you hear the knocks, it's already too late. I dropped the notebook, my blood running cold. The knocks. The ones I'd heard outside my bedroom the other night. Could the writer have been talking about the same thing? And if so, what did they mean by too late? As I stared at the notebook, a faint sound broke the silence. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again. 3 soft knocks, this time from somewhere behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tense as the knocks echoed through the attic. They were soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. I turned slowly, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the cluttered space. Nothing moved, but the air felt charged, like the house itself was holding its breath. Hello. My voice came out as a shaky whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The attic remained silent, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The knocks came again, this time louder and accompanied by a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. My flashlight flickered and I gasped, gripping it tighter as the light steadied. The sound was coming from the far wall, where the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped closer, my feet creaking on the wooden floor. As I reached the wall, I noticed something strange. A section of the paneling didn't quite match the rest. The wood was newer, less worn, as though it had been replaced recently. I ran my fingers along the edges, finding a loose seam. With a trembling hand, I pried the panel free, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was a small box, wrapped in brittle, yellowed fabric. I pulled it out carefully, my hands shaking as I set it on the floor. The box was plain and unmarked, but its weight felt significant. I hesitated, dread pooling in my stomach as I lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of old photographs, a silver locket, and another note folded neatly on top. The handwriting on the note matched the one I had found in the vent. If you've made it this far, they already know. Leave while you still can. My breath hitched as I stared at the words. What did they mean by they? My eyes drifted to the photographs and a chill ran down my spine. The images were of the house, but they weren't ordinary pictures. Each one showed something different. Shadows where there shouldn't have been any, faint outlines of figures standing in doorways, and in one, a pair of glowing eyes peering out from a window. My hands trembled as I reached for the locket, opening it to reveal a tiny portrait inside. It was a woman I didn't recognize, her expression somber and her eyes hauntingly familiar. Who was she, and why was all of this hidden here? Before I could think any further, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the room into darkness. The sound of the attic door slamming echoed through the space, reverberating in my chest. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Panic set in as I scrambled to my feet, clutching the box tightly against my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I turned toward the door, but the faint scratching sound returned, louder this time, as though it were coming from all around me. My flashlight beam landed on the far wall, where the panel I had removed now seemed darker, as if the shadows were alive and pulsing. The temperature in the attic dropped sharply, my breath forming visible puffs in the cold air. I tried to steady my nerves, focusing on the only thing I could control: getting out. I backed toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest, when a voice, low, raspy, and faint, whispered my name. "Sarah." The sound rooted me to the spot, every hair on my body standing on end. It wasn't my mom or dad. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was something else. "Sarah," the voice repeated, this time closer. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls, vibrating through the wooden beams. My grip on the box tightened and I forced myself to move, turning the doorknob with trembling hands. The door didn't budge. "No, no, no," I whispered, yanking at it, desperation clawing at me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, until it sounded like a chorus of voices murmuring my name. I pounded on the door. "Let me out." My voice cracked, tears streaming down my face as the whispers reached a fever pitch. And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The silence was so abrupt it was jarring, the kind that made my ears ring. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't wait to question it. I bolted down the stairs, clutching the box and not daring to look back. When I reached the hallway, the house felt different, heavier, darker. The shadows seemed to shift as I moved, like they were watching me. I stumbled into my room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. Collapsing onto the floor, I set the box down and tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift the locket again. The woman's face stared back at me, her eyes piercing as if she were trying to tell me something. "Who are you?" I whispered, but of course there was no answer. Only the oppressive silence of the house, which now felt more alive than ever. The next morning, the events in the attic felt like a fever dream, but the scratches on my arms and the bruises on my knees told a different story. The box sat on my desk, an ominous reminder that whatever was happening in this house wasn't going to let me ignore it. I knew I needed answers, and the only place I could start was the locket and the woman it depicted. I examined the portrait again. The woman's face was striking, strong cheekbones, a determined expression, and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. There were no markings or initials to indicate who she was, but something about her felt familiar. It was like I had seen her before, though I couldn't place where. Determined to figure it out, I headed downstairs. My mom was in the kitchen, humming softly as she made breakfast. She glanced up when I entered, her smile fading when she saw the tension in my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down the spatula. "Do you recognize this?" I asked, holding out the locket. Her brow furrowed as she took it, her fingers running over the worn metal. When she opened it and saw the portrait, her face paled. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I found it in the attic," I said. "Mom, who is she?" She stared at the locket for a long moment before shaking her head. I don't know," she said, but her hesitation betrayed her. He was lying. "You do know," I said, my voice rising. "Mom, please. This isn't just some old family keepsake. Something's happening in this house, and I think she's connected to it." My mom looked away, her hands trembling as she set the locket on the counter. "It's not what you think," she said softly. "It's just stories. Old stories about the house. They're not real." "What stories?" I pressed. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the doorway as if checking to see if my dad was nearby. "Your father wouldn't want me telling you this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But people used to say this house was cursed. That bad things happened here." "Like what?" I asked, my stomach nodding. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Disappearances. Murders. People losing their minds. The woman in that locket, she was one of them. Her family owned this house a long time ago. They say she went mad, that she locked herself in the attic and never came out." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Why didn't you tell me this before we moved in?" "Because it's nonsense," she said, her voice shaking. "Your father and I didn't believe any of it. It's just an old house, Sarah. Whatever you're experiencing, it's not real." But it felt real. Too real. And her reluctance to tell me the full story only made me more certain that there was something she wasn't saying. My mom's words lingered with me throughout the day, each one adding to the growing weight in my chest. Disappearances. Murders. People losing their minds. It wasn't just an old house. It was something much darker, something that had already pulled me into its grip. But why? Why was I the one noticing the knocks, finding the notes, and uncovering the hidden objects? Was it because of her, the woman in the locket? Determined to learn more, I decided to visit the local library. If the house had a history, there had to be some record of it. Emily, ever the supportive friend, agreed to come along. She didn't believe in ghosts, but even she couldn't ignore how shaken I had been since the move. The library was quiet and musty, with rows of shelves stretching endlessly into the dim light. We headed straight to the archives section, where old newspapers and property records were stored. The librarian, a kindly older woman, raised an eyebrow when I told her the address of the house. "That place," she said, her voice dropping. "You're living there now?" "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know anything about it?" Her expression darkened. "I've heard stories over the years. People say it's cursed, that strange things happen to anyone who lives there. I can pull the records for you, but be warned, what you find might not bring you peace." It wasn't peace I was looking for. It was answers. She returned a few minutes later with a stack of old newspapers and documents, all tied together with twine. Emily and I carried them to a nearby table and began sorting through the pile. At first it was just mundane information, construction dates, property sales. But then, buried beneath the rest, we found an article that made my blood run cold. The headline read, "Tragedy strikes at Blackwood Estate. Family vanishes without a trace." Blackwood Estate, Emily murmured, her finger tracing the faded text. "That's your house." The article was dated 1927 and detailed the mysterious disappearance of the Blackwood family, parents and 2 young children. They had been last seen in town a week before vanishing. When authorities searched the house, they found no signs of a struggle, but neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the days leading up to their disappearance. "What kind of noises?" I asked, my eyes scanning the page. Emily read further. "Knocking," she said softly. "Scratching. And whispers." My heart raced as I read the rest of the article. The Blackwood family was never found, and over the years, the house had changed hands multiple times, with each new owner reporting similar phenomena. Some stayed only weeks before fleeing, leaving the house abandoned for years. "This is insane," Emily said, leaning back in her chair. "Your house has been a horror story for decades and no one thought to tell you?" "Apparently not," I said bitterly. But there was more. The article included a grainy photograph of the Blackwood family standing in front of the house. My eyes locked on the mother, her face pale, her features unmistakable. It was the woman from the locket. The woman in the photograph stared back at me, her eyes hauntingly familiar. It wasn't just a resemblance. The woman in the locket and the mother from the Blackwood family were the same person. My hands shook as I set the newspaper down, my mind racing to connect the pieces. Emily leaned over, her face pale as she studied the image. "It's her," she whispered. "The woman from the locket. She lived in your house. And she disappeared," I said, my voice hollow. "Along with her entire family." The librarian approached cautiously, her eyes flicking to the newspaper. "You found the Blackwood story," she said softly. "I remember hearing about it as a child. My grandmother used to tell us never to go near that house." "Why?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "They say the house is cursed," she said, lowering her voice. "That it takes something from everyone who lives there. Some say it's the family, others think it's the house itself. But one thing's certain, no one who stays there leaves untouched." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I thought of the knocks, the whispers, the strange heaviness in the air. The house hadn't just been watching us, it had been waiting. "Do you know anything about the woman in the photograph?" Emily asked, gesturing to the grainy image. The librarian shook her head. "Not much. Only that her name was Evelyn Blackwood, and she was the last to be seen before the family vanished. Some say she went mad, that the house drove her to it. Or she was trying to protect her family," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe that's why she left the locket and the notes." The librarian frowned. "What notes?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "There were messages hidden in the house," I said finally. "Warnings. Like someone was trying to tell me something." Her expression darkened. "If Evelyn left those for you, it wasn't just a warning, it was a plea. She must have known this would happen." "Happen?" Emily said sharply. "What's happening?" The librarian glanced between us, her voice grave. "The house has a way of pulling people in. It doesn't let go. If you're not careful, it'll take you too." The librarian's words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Emily and I exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of what we had uncovered pressing down on us. The idea that the house could somehow pull people in, trap them, felt absurd. But after everything I had experienced, it was hard to dismiss. "Thank you for your help," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The librarian gave me a sympathetic look before returning to her desk, leaving Emily and me alone with the pile of evidence. "What do we do now?" Emily asked as we walked back to my car, the newspaper and copies of the records tucked under my arm. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't go back to that house without figuring out what's happening. If Evelyn left those notes for someone to find, maybe she was trying to stop this from happening again." Emily frowned, her hands gripping her bag tightly. "You think she knew what the house was capable of?" "Maybe," I said, unlocking the car. "Or maybe she didn't have all the answers either." But I think she was trying to protect her family, and now it's up to me to figure out how. The drive back was tense, the silence between us filled with unspoken fears. When we arrived at the house, I hesitated at the edge of the driveway, my eyes fixed on the looming silhouette of the house. The windows stared back at me like empty eyes, cold and unfeeling. "I'll go in with you," Emily said, her voice firm. "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "You don't need to get involved any more than you already have. This is my problem." "It's not just your problem," she argued. "If this house is dangerous, then someone needs to help you figure it out. Besides, I'm not letting you go in there alone." I wanted to argue, but the truth was I didn't want to face the house by myself either. With a reluctant nod, I led the way up the steps, the keys rattling in my hand as I unlocked the door. The house was colder than I remembered, the air thick and oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards echoed loudly, amplifying my growing unease. We moved cautiously through the hallway, the weight of the house's history pressing down on us. "Where do we start?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The attic," I said. "That's where I found the locket and the note. If Evelyn left anything else, it's probably there." We climbed the narrow staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The attic door loomed ahead, its peeling paint and rusted hinges a stark reminder of the night it had slammed shut behind me. This time I was ready, or so I told myself. As I pushed the door open, the cold air hit me like a wall, the familiar scent of mildew and dust filling my lungs. The attic was just as I had left it, cluttered and chaotic, but now it felt alive, like it was waiting for us. "What are we looking for?" Emily asked, her flashlight scanning the room. "Anything," I said, stepping toward the spot where I had found the box. "Anything that might explain what's happening." But as I knelt down to search, a faint whisper filled the air. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable, but it grew louder, overlapping with more voices until it became a chorus. My blood ran cold as I realized they were all saying the same thing. "Get out." The chorus of whispers filled the attic, overlapping and echoing as if the walls themselves were speaking. Emily froze beside me, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, though the fear in her voice made it clear she already knew the answer. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The voices weren't just sounds. They carried an urgency, a warning that made my skin crawl. "Get out." The words echoed in my mind, insistent and unrelenting. "We shouldn't be here," Emily said, her voice breaking. She grabbed my arm, trying to pull me toward the door, but I resisted. "Sarah, we need to leave." "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not yet. There's something here, I can feel it." Ignoring her protests, I moved toward the corner of the attic where I had found the box. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if trying to stop me. My flashlight caught a faint glimmer beneath a pile of old, rotting fabric. I knelt down and pushed the fabric aside, revealing a trapdoor set into the floor. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart pounding. The trapdoor was small and unmarked, its edges sealed with dust and age. The whispers reached a fever pitch, each word blending into the next until they became an unintelligible roar. With trembling hands I gripped the rusted handle and pulled. The trapdoor groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow, dark space below. The air that rose from it was colder than the attic, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. "Sarah, please," Emily begged, her voice shaking. "Let's go. This isn't safe." But I couldn't stop now. Something was drawing me toward the space below, an invisible force I couldn't ignore. "I have to see what's down there," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and lowered myself into the opening, my feet finding purchase on a narrow ladder that descended into the darkness. Emily hesitated for a moment before following, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The space below was small and cramped, the dirt floor uneven beneath our feet. The air was thick and damp, and the walls were lined with old wooden beams, some of which had been scratched and gouged deeply. In the center of the room was a table, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. On it sat a single object, a book bound in cracked black leather. "This is insane," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" I reached out, my hands trembling as I picked up the book. The cover was blank, but the pages inside were filled with dense handwriting, the ink faded but legible. As I flipped through, one line caught my eye, written in bold letters across the top of a page. The house watches. The house takes. The house keeps. The words on the page sent a chill through me. The house watches. The house takes. The house keeps. It felt like a declaration, a warning etched into time by someone who had seen the truth and survived long enough to record it. But what did it mean? Emily leaned over my shoulder, her breath shallow. This is insane, she whispered. Who wrote this? I turned the pages carefully, the faint sound of the paper crinkling under my fingers. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, as if the writer had been racing against time. Most of the entries were fragmented, ramblings about shadows that moved, whispers in the walls, and a presence that could never be seen but always felt. One entry, dated shortly before the disappearance of the Blackwood family, caught my eye. The house has chosen us. It knows our secrets, our fears. It will not let us go. Evelyn believes there is a way to stop it, but she won't say how. He's too afraid. But if she's wrong, we'll all be lost. Evelyn, I murmured, my fingers brushing over her name. The woman in the locket. The mother in the photograph. She had been the key to everything, and now it seemed she had been the only one who truly understood the house's power. Emily pointed to another line further down the page. Look, she said. She mentioned a way to stop it. I scanned the passage, my heart racing. The heart of the house lies below. Beneath the floorboards where no light can reach. To sever the connection, the heart must be destroyed. But it will fight back. It always fights back. The heart of the house, Emily said, her voice trembling. What do you think that means? I don't know, I admitted, my throat tight. But if Evelyn thought it could stop the house, then we have to try. Emily stared at me, her expression filled with fear. Sarah, this is dangerous. What if it's not just a metaphor? What if this heart is something worse? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't turn back now. Whatever the heart was, it had to be the source of everything. The whispers, the shadows, the disappearances. If we didn't stop it, we'd become just another story in the house's dark history. We'll figure it out, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. There has to be more in the book. I flipped through the remaining pages, searching for more clues. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting, the ink smeared as though written in a hurry. It's too late for us. But if you find this, you still have a chance. Don't let the house take you. Find the heart. Destroy it. Before it destroys you. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Evelyn had left this behind, a desperate plea for whoever came after her. She had known the house would claim her, but she had also believed it could be stopped. Emily touched my arm gently. What now? I took a deep breath, closing the book and tucking it under my arm. We find the heart. Finding the heart of the house sounded impossible, but deep down I knew Evelyn's words were true. The house wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it thrived on fear and secrets. If there was a way to stop it, I had to try. Emily and I climbed out of the hidden space and back into the attic, the black leather book tucked tightly under my arm. The whispers had stopped for now, but the oppressive silence felt even worse, as if the house were watching, waiting for us to make our next move. What do you think she meant by beneath the floorboards? Emily asked, her voice trembling. I thought back to the trapdoor, the hollow space below. It had seemed small at first, but could there have been more to it? Maybe there's another hidden space, I said. Somewhere deeper. We searched the attic again, this time more methodically. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart jump, and every shadow seemed darker than it should have been. Then near the far wall I noticed something strange. A section of the floorboards that didn't quite match the rest. The wood was smoother, newer, and faint scratches surrounded the edges, as though someone had tried to pry it open before. This has to be it, I said, kneeling down. I used the handle of the flashlight to wedge the boards loose, my hands trembling with each pull. The boards came away slowly, revealing a dark, gaping hole that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. Emily shined her flashlight into the hole, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. How deep do you think it goes? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I admitted. But this is where we need to go. Sarah, wait, she said, grabbing my arm. Are you sure about this? What if it's a trap? What if the house wants us to go down there? She was right to be scared, I was scared too. But if Evelyn believed the heart of the house could be destroyed, then I had to believe it too. We don't have a choice, I said firmly. If we don't stop this now, it'll just keep happening. With one last deep breath, I lowered myself into the hole, the cold air sending a shiver down my spine. The narrow passage was rough and uneven, the walls pressing tightly against my shoulders as I climbed downward. Emily followed reluctantly, her flashlight casting flickering shadows on the dirt walls. The passage seemed to go on forever, and the deeper we went, the colder it became. My hands ached from gripping the ladder, but I didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my feet touched solid ground. The space below was vast and cavernous, the air thick and heavy. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. I shined my flashlight around, the beam revealing jagged walls covered in strange markings. In the center of the room was something that made my blood run cold. A massive pulsating mass of roots and veins, glowing faintly with an unnatural red light. "The heart," I whispered. The sight of the heart was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. It was alive, pulsing rhythmically like it was breathing. The faint red light it emitted cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the sound, a low, steady thrum, seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. Emily stood frozen beside me, her flashlight shaking in her hands. What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The heart of the house," I said, my voice trembling. "This is what Evelyn was talking about." The closer I stepped, the heavier the air felt. The heart seemed to react to my presence, its pulsations growing faster, more erratic. I could feel it, an overwhelming sense of anger, of desperation, as if the house knew what I intended to do. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "How do we destroy something like this?" I opened the black leather book, flipping through the pages for guidance. Evelyn's final entry had said the heart could be destroyed, but it hadn't explained how. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Fire? Physical blow? Or something else entirely? As I stepped closer, I noticed something embedded in the base of the heart. A shard of metal, faintly glowing with the same red light. It looked like a blade, its edges jagged and worn as though it had been there for years. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Emily nodded, her eyes wide. "What is it?" "I don't know," I said, moving toward it. "But I think it's important." The heart throbbed violently as I reached out to touch the shard, a wave of heat radiating through the air. My fingers brushed the metal, and an electric jolt shot up my arm, forcing me to pull back. "Sarah," Emily cried, grabbing my arm. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, though my hand throbbed where I had touched the shard. "But I think this is what's keeping the heart alive." Her eyes widened. "You think it's a stake? Like the kind you'd use to kill a monster?" "Something like that," I said. "If it is, then pulling it out might be the only way to stop the house. Or it could make things worse," she said. "What if it's holding the heart back and removing it releases whatever's inside?" I hesitated, her words sinking in. She was right, there was no way to know what would happen. But Evelyn's warnings, the notes, the journal, they all pointed to this moment. If we didn't try, the house would never stop. "I have to do this," I said firmly. "You should go back up. You don't have to stay." "No way," she said, her voice shaking. "If you're doing this, I'm staying with you." Taking a deep breath, I gripped the shard with both hands. The heat intensified, and the heart's pulsations grew louder, filling the cavern with a deafening rhythm. My arms shook as I pulled, the shard resisting at first, but then with a sickening lurch, it came free. The heart let out a piercing, inhuman scream, its glow flaring bright enough to blind us. The ground trembled violently, and the air grew impossibly cold. Emily grabbed my arm, pulling me back as the heart began to wither, its pulsations slowing and the red light fading into darkness. The cavern was plunged into silence, the absence of the heart's throbbing almost deafening in its stillness. Emily and I stood frozen, our breaths visible in the icy air as the ground beneath us settled. The heart, once a glowing, pulsating mass, had withered into a brittle, lifeless husk, its red light extinguished. "Is it over?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I think so," I said, though I wasn't sure. My hands still ached from pulling the shard free, and my mind raced with unanswered questions. What had we just done? Had we truly destroyed the heart, or had we unleashed something worse? We climbed back up the narrow passage, the silence following us like a shadow. When we emerged into the attic, the air felt lighter, cleaner, as though a weight had been lifted. The whispers were gone, and for the first time since we moved in, the house felt quiet. Emily let out a shaky laugh. I can't believe we just did that. Me neither, I admitted, my legs trembling as I sat down on the floor. But I think it worked. The house, it feels different. She nodded, but her expression remained cautious. Do you think it's really over? I don't know, I said honestly. But I think we stopped whatever was keeping the house alive. At least for now. We left the attic and made our way downstairs, where the rest of the house seemed equally transformed. The oppressive heaviness was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. I ran my hand along the hallway wall, expecting to feel the same sense of unease that had plagued me since we moved in, but there was nothing. Just cold plaster and wood. My parents returned later that evening, their cheerful chatter filling the house as they unloaded groceries. My mom's smile faltered when she saw me sitting in the living room, the black leather book and the shard resting on the coffee table. What's this? She asked, her voice uncertain. It's the truth about this house, I said, my voice steady. And what's been happening here? My dad frowned, setting down a bag of groceries. What are you talking about? For the next hour I told them everything, about the notes, the locket, the history of the house, and the heart hidden beneath the attic. I didn't hold back, letting them see the fear and confusion I had carried for weeks. Emily chimed in to back up my story, her voice shaking as she described what we had seen in the cavern. By the time we finished, my parents were pale, their expressions a mix of disbelief and horror. This is insane, my dad said finally, running a hand through his hair. You expect us to believe the house was alive? I don't care if you believe it, I said firmly. But it's the truth. And if you don't want this to happen to someone else, we need to leave. My dad paced the living room, his face drawn with tension. Sarah, you're asking us to uproot our lives because of something that might not even be real. Emily stood up, her hands clenched into fists. I saw it too, she said, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering in her eyes. We both did. The heart, the whispers, everything. This house isn't just old, it's dangerous. My mom sat down heavily on the couch, her gaze fixed on the shard of metal resting on the coffee table. And you think removing this thing stopped it? She asked quietly. I don't know, I admitted. But I do know that the house feels different now. The heaviness is gone. The whispers are gone. Whatever was feeding the house, it's not there anymore. But for how long? Emily added. The house has a history of pulling people in, of taking them. Even if it's quiet now, who's to say it won't start again? My dad stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping as he turned to look at me. You really believe this, don't you? He asked, his voice softer. Yes, I said firmly. I don't just believe it, I know it. This house isn't safe and we need to leave before it's too late. He glanced at my mom, who looked as though she was on the verge of tears. I don't know what to think, she said, her voice trembling. This was supposed to be our fresh start. But now. It can still be a fresh start, I said gently. Just not here. The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling over us like a heavy blanket. Finally, my dad let out a long sigh. He said, We'll start looking for a new place tomorrow. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that we weren't out of danger yet. Until we left, the house still had its grip on us. That night as I lay in bed, I felt the difference in the air. The oppressive heaviness was gone, but a lingering unease remained. The house might have lost its power, but its history was still etched into its walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting. In the morning I woke to the sound of movement downstairs. My parents had already begun packing, their voices muffled but calm. Emily had stayed the night, unwilling to leave me alone in the house. Together we loaded boxes into her car, the act of preparing to leave feeling like a small victory. But as I carried a box out to the driveway, something caught my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the yard, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. My heart raced as I squinted against the morning light, trying to make out the details. It was a woman, her pale face partially obscured by the branches. Evelyn. I dropped the box, my breath catching in my throat. Emily, I called, my voice shaking. She ran to my side, following my gaze, but by the time she looked, the figure was gone. What is it? She asked, her voice laced with concern. Nothing, I lied, though my hands were trembling. It's nothing. But deep down I knew it wasn't nothing. Evelyn's presence was a reminder, a warning. The house might have quieted, but its story wasn't over. And neither was mine. For the rest of the day I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the house louder. Emily noticed my unease, but I didn't tell her about the figure in the yard. I didn't want to alarm her, or admit that a part of me believed Evelyn was still here, somehow tied to the house. By evening most of the boxes were packed, stacked neatly by the front door. My parents were exhausted but relieved, their earlier tension replaced by a quiet determination to leave as soon as possible. It was the first time in weeks that they seemed truly aligned, their shared goal of escaping the house bringing them together. "We'll start loading the truck in the morning," my dad said, rubbing his temples. "One more night here and then we're out." One more night. The word sent a chill down my spine. I nodded, forcing a smile, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the silence oppressive in its own way. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the events of the past weeks playing over and over in my mind. The heart, the whispers, the warnings, it all felt like a blur, yet the memories were seared into me. Sometime after midnight I heard it. A faint creak, followed by the softest of knocks. My breath caught as I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, this time louder and unmistakably from the hallway. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Every instinct told me to stay put, but something deeper, a need to know, to understand, pulled me toward the door. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped into the hallway, the beam cutting through the darkness. The house felt different again, the air heavier, thicker, as though it had regained some of its power. The knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, leading me toward the stairs. I followed cautiously, each step creaking beneath my weight. At the bottom of the stairs the knocking stopped. I scanned the living room, my flashlight revealing only shadows and the packed boxes. For a moment I thought it was over, that the house was playing tricks on me again. But then I saw it. The front door, slightly ajar, swinging gently as though it had just been opened. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I approached the door slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached it I pushed it open, stepping out onto the porch. The night was still, the yard bathed in faint moonlight. And there, standing at the edge of the driveway, was Evelyn. She didn't move, her pale face illuminated by the moonlight. Her eyes locked on mine, filled with something I couldn't quite name. Sorrow, urgency, maybe even fear. For a moment we just stared at each other, the silence between us more powerful than any words. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She lifted a hand, pointing toward the house. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, her figure dissolving into the shadows. The moment Evelyn vanished, a cold wind swept through the yard, sending shivers down my spine. The house loomed behind me, its dark windows like unblinking eyes. I turned back toward the front door, her silent gesture replaying in my mind. She was pointing to the house. But why? What else could it want from me? Emily appeared in the doorway, her face pale and etched with worry. "Sarah? What are you doing out here?" she asked, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. I hesitated, unsure how to explain what I had just seen. I saw something," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "But it's gone now." Emily glanced past me into the shadows, her brow furrowing. "Let's go back inside," she said. "We don't need to give this house any more power than it already has." Reluctantly I followed her, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the icy air outside. The quiet had returned, but it felt different this time, like the house was waiting, watching to see what I would do next. As dawn broke, my parents began loading the moving truck, their movements brisk and efficient. Emily and I joined them, carrying box after box down the front steps. The sense of urgency was palpable, as though we all understood that staying too long would be a mistake. But with every trip to the truck, I felt Evelyn's presence tugging at me. Her gesture, her expression, they hadn't been random. She had been trying to tell me something. And whatever it was, I couldn't ignore it. By the time the truck was nearly full, I couldn't take it anymore. "I need to check something before we leave," I said, setting down the box I was carrying. "Sarah, no," Emily said, her voice filled with alarm. "We're almost done. Don't go back in there." "I won't be long," I promised, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "I just need to be sure." She sighed, clearly torn, but nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But I'm coming with you." Together we stepped back into the house, the familiar chill settling over us like a heavy blanket. The living room, now empty of boxes, felt cavernous and eerie. I stood in the center, turning slowly, trying to sense what Evelyn had been pointing to. "Where do we even start?" Emily asked, her voice hushed. I didn't respond, my gaze drawn to the fireplace. Something about it seemed different now, though I couldn't explain why. I approached it slowly, running my fingers along the edges of the mantel. The wood felt colder than it should have, almost icy. "There's something here," I said, my voice trembling. Emily shined her flashlight on the brickwork, her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" I crouched down, examining the base of the fireplace. One of the bricks seemed loose, its edges worn and uneven. With trembling hands I pried it free, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was a small leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded. "What is that?" Emily asked, crouching beside me. I opened the book carefully, the brittle pages crackling under my fingers. The handwriting was familiar. Evelyn's. The first page was a note, written in bold, hurried strokes. "The heart is gone, but the house is not finished. Its power lies in the memories it keeps. Burn them and you burn its hold. But beware, the house will fight to survive." My breath caught as the words sank in. The locket, the journal, the photographs, all the items tied to the house's history were the key. If Evelyn was right, destroying them might sever its power for good. The idea of burning the items filled me with dread, but Evelyn's words left no room for doubt. "Burn them and you burn its hold." It was the final step, the last chance to rid ourselves of the house's lingering power. But the warning at the end of her note chilled me to the core. "The house will fight to survive." I gathered the items we had uncovered. The locket, the black leather book, the photographs, and the notes. Each one felt heavier than it should have, as though the house itself was trying to hold on to them. Emily stood silently beside me, her face pale but resolute. "We need to do this now," I said, my voice trembling. "Before we lose our nerve." She nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. "Where do we burn them?" "The fireplace," I said. It seemed fitting, almost poetic, to use the heart of the house against itself. I carried the items to the hearth, laying them carefully on the grate. The locket was the last thing I placed, its silver surface catching the dim light one final time before I stepped back. "Do you think it'll work?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's our only chance." I struck a match, the tiny flame flickering in the cold air, and dropped it onto the pile. The fire caught quickly, the dry pages of Evelyn's journal feeding the flames. For a moment nothing happened. The items burned quietly, the smoke curling lazily up the chimney. Then the house screamed. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, a piercing, inhuman wail that shook the walls and rattled the windows. The floor beneath us trembled, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing every light except the fire. Emily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin as we both froze in terror. "What's happening?" she cried, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise. "The house," I said, my voice shaking. "It's fighting back." The flames roared higher, turning an unnatural shade of blue, and the shadows in the room began to move. They stretched and twisted, coiling around the walls like living things. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew so thick it was hard to breathe. "We need to get out of here," Emily shouted, pulling at my arm. "Not yet," I said, forcing myself to stay. "It has to be finished." The fire burned brighter, consuming the locket and the photographs, until all that remained was ash. The scream grew louder, reaching an unbearable pitch, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was overwhelming, the kind that made my ears ring. The fire died down, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. The shadows receded, and the oppressive heaviness that had haunted the house was gone. "It's over," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a wave. "It's really over." Emily sank to the floor beside me, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe we did it," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't believe it's gone." But as I looked around the now empty room, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The house was quiet, its power broken, but its history would never leave me. Evelyn's sacrifice, the family's disappearance, and everything I had uncovered would stay with me forever. As the sun rose, its golden light filtering through the windows, the house looked almost normal, peaceful even. The dark, oppressive energy that had once filled every corner was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar calm. For the first time since we moved in, I could breathe freely. Emily and I sat in the living room, staring at the faint embers still glowing in the fireplace. Neither of us spoke for a while, too drained to put our thoughts into words. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I nodded slowly. "It feels different now. Like the house let go." She gave me a small, tired smile. "You were brave, you know. Most people would have run." "I wanted to," I admitted, leaning back against the wall. "But Evelyn didn't have the chance to finish this. I couldn't let her sacrifice be for nothing." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think she's at peace now?" I thought of the figure I had seen in the yard, her sorrowful gaze and silent gesture. She had been tied to the house, her story unfinished. But now, with the heart destroyed and her belongings burned, it felt like the final chapter had been written. "I hope so," I said quietly. She deserved better. Later that morning, my parents came downstairs, still groggy from the stress of the past few days. They were surprised to see the locket, the photographs, and the journal reduced to ashes in the fireplace. I explained what had happened, leaving out the more supernatural details to spare them the horror of what we had truly faced. "So it's done?" my dad asked, his tone a mix of relief and disbelief. "Yes," I said. "But we still need to leave. This house, it's not meant to be lived in." My mom hesitated, her gaze drifting to the now empty walls. "It's strange," she said. "I was so excited about this place, but now I can't wait to go. It feels like it was never really ours." "It wasn't," I said firmly. "It belonged to the past. And it's time to leave it there." We spent the rest of the day loading the truck, our movements faster and lighter than before. The house seemed to watch us as we worked, its quietness no longer threatening but almost contemplative. When the last box was packed, I stood on the front porch, taking one final look at the place that had changed me forever. As we drove away, the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, its dark silhouette fading into the distance. Emily sat beside me, her hand resting on mine, a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone. My parents followed in the moving truck, their expressions unreadable but calm. "What happens now?" Emily asked as the town blurred past us. "We move on," I said, my voice steady. "And we don't look back." But as the road stretched out before us, I couldn't help but feel a lingering connection to the house. Its secrets were laid to rest, but its story would stay with me forever. A reminder of the strength it took to face the darkness and the courage to break free. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after everything we had been through. My parents found a new house in a quiet neighborhood a few towns over, a place with no history, no secrets, and no heavy shadows lurking in the corners. Emily stayed by my side through it all, helping me unpack, settle in, and process what we'd experienced. She didn't bring up the house often, and I didn't press her to. Some things were better left unspoken, at least for a while. But I couldn't shake the lingering weight of what had happened. Late at night, when the world was still, I found myself replaying the events in my mind. The whispers, the locket, Evelyn's warnings. The house might have released its grip, but its memory clung to me like a shadow. One night, as I was unpacking the last of my boxes, I came across the burnt remains of one of Evelyn's notes. I had kept it, unable to bring myself to throw it away. The edges were charred, but the words in the center were still legible. "The heart is gone, but the house is not finished." I stared at the note for a long time, my mind racing with what it could mean. Was it a final warning, or just the ramblings of a woman driven mad by the house's power? I wanted to believe the latter, but deep down I knew the truth. The house might have lost its heart, but its story wasn't over. One day, while browsing through old records at the library, half out of curiosity, half out of habit, I stumbled across something that sent a chill through me. It was a property listing for the house. Someone had bought it. I stared at the listing, my stomach twisting. The new owners had no idea what they were walking into, no way of knowing the history that lurked within those walls. Part of me wanted to reach out to warn them, but what could I say? That the house was alive. That it had a history of taking people? They'd think I was crazy. Instead, I folded the listing into my pocket, the weight of it pressing against me for the rest of the day. I couldn't save everyone, but maybe I could find a way to prevent the cycle from continuing. Emily found me sitting on the porch that evening, the listing still clutched in my hand. "You're thinking about the house, aren't you?" she asked, sitting beside me. I nodded. "Someone bought it. Someone's moving in." Her expression darkened. Sarah, you did everything you could. You can't carry this forever. But what if it starts again? I said, my voice breaking. What if the house pulls them in like it did with us? Then it's their story, she said gently. You've done your part. You broke the house's hold. That's more than anyone else could have done. Her words were comforting, but the worry lingered. The house might be quiet for now, but its story wasn't finished. And neither was mine.